Hello and welcome to Game Spotting. I'm Rich Gallup. Today we travel through time with a pair of GameSpot's wisest editors as we celebrate the 15th anniversary of one of the most endearing mascots of recent memory, Sonic the Hedgehog. From speeding through side-scrollers to fighting and even puzzle games, Sonic and crew have done it all. First, let's take you back to where it all started, the Sega Genesis.
Sonic the Hedgehog debuted in 1991 on the Sega Genesis. Basically, Sega needed a mascot character, something to really sell their system because the Super Nintendo was coming out soon.
Sonic the Hedgehog caught a lot of attention because, it was pretty much Sega's line in the sand. It was direct competition to Mario.
They needed something to give them an identifiable image and a look that people could really latch onto and say, that's Sega.
The smart thing that Sega did was they didn't try and take Mario on sort of in the traditional platforming format that he was known for. What Sega did was they sort of created their own sort of take on the platformer.
So Sega came out with Sonic the Hedgehog, who is their first real mascot character, and he kind of had a little bit of an attitude, a little bit of edge that Mario was lacking, and a lot of people really identified with that.
And they introduced pretty much the key concepts that have been sort of integral to all the Sonic titles.
Sonic was just all about speed.
And the sense of speed in that game was really awesome. He was like a rocket. And the power-ups that you would find in the game kind of were the same idea. You could get shoes to make you go even faster.
Occasionally jump over a pit or something, jump on an enemy. You'd go through these giant roller coaster-like loops.
You had an interactive environment, which these days we all take for granted, but back then it was pretty eye-popping to see.
It was just a quick, visceral thrill. Didn't take a lot of effort. You could just get into it, fly through a few levels, and just have some simple fun.
It was like a combination of a really cool feeling and a feeling of, oh my God, what's going to happen, because you were going so fast. You knew that at some point something was going to hit you and you were going to drop all your rings. And the rings were also another really cool concept, which is if you were good, you could theoretically not die in the game because you needed to hold on to a certain number of rings. And every time you got hit by an enemy, you would drop them. But if you were good, you could hang on to them, you could get through the game. Even if it was only with one ring, you could get through and never die, which was very cool. Sonic 2 kind of continued the trend and built on a lot of the things that really spoke to people in the first game.
You just start at one end of a level and run really fast through to the other end, collecting rings and freeing the little animals.
The sense of speed was back, the graphics got more ornate, and they introduced a sidekick. People either loved or hated him, but as far as sidekicks go, Miles Tails Prower, which was a little, two-tailed fox who could fly, was, he wasn't too bad. He actually had a little bit of personality.
And what you could do is the second player could kind of control him a little bit. It didn't really affect gameplay all that much, but it just kind of built out the Sonic universe by throwing in more characters.
Sonic was the edgy guy, and Tails was like his nice sidekick. He was basically like a little kid who idolized Sonic and wanted to be just like him, so he would come around and try and help. And he had his own bits of personality because he could fly, but he couldn't fly for very long. He'd get tired. So you'd see him start to fly with his tails spinning, and then he'd sort of get out of breath and get tired and kind of sink to the ground and be mellow. And it was little touches like that that really kind of made that character stand out. And he was a good fit for Sonic.
Basically, though, the gameplay in Sonic 2 was the same, but it's still one of the highlights of the series just because it got everything down really tight. And a lot of Sega Genesis sold with Sonic 2 as the pack-in title. So after Sonic 2 came, of course, Sonic 3, which basically was the same, but it introduced another new character in Knuckles, which was this sort of flying kind of hedgehog pink character that nobody really knew what he was, but he was just another character, and he kind of had a little bit of a bad attitude, which was kind of cool at the time.
Sonic Team started to really have a lot of fun with the character. You started to see them try a lot more kind of outlandish things in the environment that you'd like shoot off of and jump off of. They got a little crazier with the bonus rounds where you'd have to get jewels and stuff. They introduced some 3D stuff actually. It's very simple 3D, mind you. You're just kind of running on a grid, but it kept the series moving forward in terms of its visuals and its gameplay, and it always felt very cutting edge. It was really pushing him as a personality as much as he was kind of like a game experience. Sonic and Knuckles was kind of a landmark title, not so much for the Sonic series, you know, because it did something incredibly new and different, but more from a technological standpoint. They were really smart about sort of using old content, and they released this cartridge that you could put your old Sonic games into, and then you would access new content.
So you could flip down the top of the cartridge, throw in Sonic 2 or Sonic 3, and it would alter those games. So you'd have like Knuckles in your Sonic 3 game as playable character.
And everybody was really excited because there were certain things, you know, in Sonic 3 that people had tried to get to, tried to access, and they couldn't quite get it, and they didn't know why. They thought, you know, maybe they sucked at the game, but in actual fact what it was you needed to be Knuckles. For Knuckles, he could climb on objects and he could glide, which is a different kind of flying, and he could also punch stuff. And it gave everybody their own sort of like unique elements.
So after Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles, there were a couple other Sonic titles on the Sega Genesis. One was Sonic Spinball.
Sonic Spinball came out of the era when Sonic was popular, really popular, and Sega wanted to capitalize on that.
Sonic was in ball form, and he'd just spin through these pinball tables, and you were basically just playing pinball with Sonic the Hedgehog. It was kind of a neat idea.
And the gameplay actually ended up feeling pretty good. It was a pretty decent pinball game for the day. It really pushed the Genesis. There was some slowdown and whatnot, but they actually did have the Sonic feel. They used all the sound effects. They used a lot of familiar locations and graphics and whatnot. So it was as authentic a Sonic pinball experience as you could get.
Another one was Sonic 3D Blast, which was kind of an isometric perspective where Sonic would run through this 3D level.
They were sort of dabbling in 3D. There weren't too many polygons in there at all. It was all trickery through sprites and whatnot, and perspective. For better or for worse, Sega opted to outsource it. It ended up going to Traveler's Tales, who had a very different approach. They did a good job of kind of getting the look right,
but it kind of lacked the speed and the fun and simplicity of the other Sonic games.
The gameplay was slower than the other Sonic games, which is kind of how the series has gone as it's gone to 3D. You ended up going to Flicky Island and collecting a lot of birds. You'd have to collect 10 birds and then take them to a warp gate and free them. From a technological standpoint, it was cool because there was a lot of stuff going on screen. The sprites were big, and, you know, it was Sonic.
So after the Genesis, we had the Sega CD, and there was one game that was probably the best game on the Sega CD, which is Sonic CD.
Sonic CD was Sega's very smart move towards getting people to kind of adopt the Sega CD peripheral, which kind of didn't take off. It's a shame that the peripheral didn't take off as much as it did, because Sonic CD is one of the most loved games in the series because it nailed so many things.
It had a little bit more visual detail, and the music was actually really good. It was one of the highlights in the music of the Sonic franchise that a lot of fans really enjoyed.
It was still in 2D, and it still had everything that everybody loved about the 2D stuff, but the addition of the color and the music and even a little bit of anime just gave the game that extra oomph to really get people into it.
So on the Sega Saturn, which was the console that came out after the Sega Genesis, Sonic really didn't have much of a presence. There was a Knights game, which was kind of a spin-off of the Sonic franchise, but there was really no true Sonic game on the Sega Saturn. So while Sonic didn't have much of a presence on the Sega Saturn, the next console from Sega was the Dreamcast. And that console launched in 1999 with Sonic Adventure, which was Sonic's true first foray into full 3D.
There was a lot riding on it because in a lot of ways it was, in fans' eyes, comparable to Super Mario 64. And Sonic never actually made an appearance, an original appearance on the Sega Saturn to what people wanted. And it was the first kind of original 3D Sonic game.
It was a lot more expansive, but it was still familiar because it still had the same kind of fast and quick and simple gameplay that Sonic was known for.
It wasn't quite perfect, but it was a really cool way to translate Sonic into 3D.
Basically, he just cruised around this 3D world. He was still super fast, still had all his abilities. He could crouch into a ball and spin and jump on enemies and things like that.
It was sort of a more adventure-style type game.
It was a lot of fun. It was a lot more expansive. It was a lot more detailed and lengthy adventure than we had seen Sonic in previously. And it also introduced some other characters.
You got to play Sonic, you got to play as Tails, you got to play some new characters, a robot, because, you know, kids love robots. And it had a lot of the Sonic feel. It was very fast, there was crazy camera movement, there was all the stuff that you wanted out of a Sonic game.
Sonic Adventure 2 came out later, and it just kind of expanded on the same concept of Sonic Adventure 1.
Sonic Adventure 2 had a lot in common with Sonic 2 on the Genesis because, once again, you had kind of a more confident game that was building on its predecessor.
It's just more of kind of the same running around, platforming in 3D. It wasn't especially remarkable, but it offered the same kind of fun that Sonic fans were looking for at the time.
And it also introduced a new character, which was Shadow the Hedgehog. And, you know, he wasn't as cute as Tails, and he wasn't quite as organic as Tails. He was a little bit more calculated, you know, because it was sort of a black, edgy hedgehog to sort of like counter Sonic. The story was sort of interesting, but a little hard to follow. People were sort of on the fence about the game because it did follow the structure of Sonic Adventure 1. You did have a certain amount of playable characters, and you had to, you know, use them in sort of like areas that were tailored to their specific skills. Probably the coolest thing about Sonic Adventure 2 was the Sonic and Shadow levels, because the one complaint a lot of people had about Sonic Adventure was it was fast, but it wasn't 2D fast. And you didn't have that sort of like crazy, oh my god, what's going to happen feeling, because you kind of knew it was going to happen. You were going to fall off the edge of the world and you were going to die. And so in Sonic Adventure 2, what happened was you had levels that were sort of on rails in certain sequences, but the bottom line was they were incredibly fast. They were just like wickedly fast, and they were almost as fast as the 2D stuff. And you had that same rush. You didn't have to worry about too much. You just need to worry about keeping that line.
After Sega stopped supporting the Dreamcast and that went away, Sonic had to move to other platforms. So the Sonic Advance games came out on the Game Boy, and there were 3 of those, and they kind of brought it back to the simple gameplay where you're just kind of going from left to right, running real fast, jumping over things, going through loops and corkscrews and things like that. So they were a lot of fun.
Sonic has had to do what all mascots have done, you know, with the current generation of platforms, which is he's had to go 3D. And there are a lot of people who have been longtime fans and haven't quite gotten the same charge out of his 3D games as his 2D. And for a while, they were, you know, it looked like we were never going to see a 2D Sonic game. Thankfully, you know, there's the Game Boy Advance. Sonic Team and Sega obviously wanted to keep their fans happy, so they've started sort of a side series called Sonic Advance that features, you know, the people that we know. There's Sonic and there's Tails, and there's some new people. You know, there's Cream the Rabbit, who's new, and she's got sort of a chow with her, which is one of the characters that were introduced in Sonic's 3D games. They are really, really close to the spirit of the old school Sonic games, and they introduced some new features as well that have kept, you know, that have been fun and have that sort of like old school appeal to people. So if you need your 2D Sonic fix, you know you'll always have the Advance series. The Sonic series has had sort of a weird life because it was a Sega property, and the Sonic games were always Sega games. When Sega pulled out of hardware, there was a question as to what was going to happen. What we saw were Sonic Adventure 1 and 2 get ported over to the GameCube with some new content. And that was sort of a good solution, but the temporary solution was a game called Sonic Heroes, which was kind of a Sonic game, but they mixed in a couple things. It was basically you're controlling a team of 3 characters.
All of the characters that had previously been introduced, like Amy, Cream, Knuckles, Shadow the Hedgehog, and it introduced kind of a team play mechanic. So you'd be going through this level like in a Sonic Adventure game, but you'd have a team of characters, each with their own special ability, and you'd have to utilize that special ability to get through certain areas in the level.
Alright! Hey guys, spread out! Level up!
Sonic Heroes, I think, still struck a chord with people because in a lot of ways it's sort of like riding on people's affection for that character. And, you know, the fact that he's been around for this long kind of speaks to the fact that there's something about him that still speaks to people regardless of generation, which is quite a feat because you don't see that anymore.
There have also been a couple spin-offs. Shadow the Hedgehog actually got his own game that Sonic was in, but he wasn't even a main character.
I think a lot of people wanted it to be a Sonic game because it looked like it had all the earmarks, but it was a very different animal.
This game had a lot darker tone than past Sonic games. It was still a 3D adventure game where you're running around real fast, but this one had guns and you're actually fighting people, so that was kind of a controversial thing, and it was the first in a Sonic series.
Shadow is his own character, and you know, to their credit, Sega made a game that was tailored to that character.
And it actually did have quite a few of the Sonic favorites in it, but the gameplay just wasn't that good, and it just kind of had its flaws.
It had Sonic elements, but ultimately there was some gunplay involved. There was, picking up objects, a lot of stuff that Sonic doesn't do in his game. So it didn't quite work out. Like if you were a Sonic fan looking for a fix, that wasn't quite the one for you.
Recently, just last year, Sonic kind of returned to its roots on this Nintendo DS with Sonic Rush, which took the gameplay and made it even simpler by making it basically just running really fast through the levels. The platforming and the enemy fighting, the boss fights were reduced to a minimum, so you'd just run through level after level, and it went over both screens, so you could run down these long stretches, up through loops, corkscrews, all kinds of crazy stuff. And the level design was actually pretty cool, and it was a pretty fun game, just because it reminded you of the original Sonic.
It totally could have been a game that came out back during the Genesis era in terms of feel, because it's got that incredible sense of speed. But at the same time, you've got sort of like a next-gen sheen to it, because Sonic's been redone in this really cool, funky, cel-shaded style, and it's got really, really good music that maybe isn't quite in line with the Sonic stuff back then, but it's very contemporary, and it has the same feel to it, which is great.
Let's do it!
What you end up having is this really amazing 2D game at its core that's got some 3D elements, because all the boss fights are 3D battles that happen sort of in like, different on planes that sort of take advantage of the 3D space. Ultimately, you've had, in a lot of ways, the game I think that everybody had been hoping to get quite a few years ago, before 3D technology could do what it does now. And 2D had kind of maxed out. And you end up having this really great hybrid game that is just a lot of fun.
The most recent Sonic game is Sonic Riders, which is kind of a racing game with all your favorite Sonic characters, where they're on boards just flying down hills at super speed.
You've got Sonic, you've got the core people, but you've also got a whole bunch of other characters which happen to be birds, because birds like to airboard.
Oh, not bad.
It's pretty simple, there's not a lot to it,
There's a whole trick system involved. It's kind of a racing game.
but it's got the speed that Sonic fans crave.
See ya.
It's aimed at like people that are either hardcore Sonic fans that'll play anything with him in it, or kids that are just in for a good time and just, want to do something silly.
Oh, new competition.
Original Sonic games are very much events, just like original Mario games, which, you can't really say that about too many games these days. But the Sonic games are events. When they come out, you know that they're going to be special. Unfortunately, special takes time. So Sega has opted to not do a Sonic game for the remainder of this generation, and are focusing their efforts on a new Sonic game that's going to come out for next-gen platforms. Now that he's turning 15, you know, there's always thoughts as to what's going to happen with Sonic in the future. As we mentioned, there is definitely a next-gen title in the works. We've seen some of it at the Tokyo Game Show, and it looks amazing. People are definitely taking advantage of the next-gen hardware to do something bigger in scale. The one thing about Sonic has always been speed and scale, and it seems like he's going to be a good fit for the next-gen platforms. We'll be curious to see what he looks like in the final game, but definitely he's a character that's been able to evolve with the times. So, what happens for him in the future is pretty much, sky's the limit.
We hope you've enjoyed our look at the history of Sonic the Hedgehog. For more on the Sonic games or any other video game for that matter, visit us online at www.gamespot.com. I'm Rich Gallup, and we'll see you soon.